But thank you for the introduction. I am the new medical director. Well, been now a little under 2 years with the NIH NHGRI RUNX1 Natural History Program. And today we're going to discuss a little bit about what we've been finding. We'll go a little bit over some of the basic stuff that is important, and hopefully it's some material that you've already heard. But since there are some new and some old faces on the call, we just wanted to make sure everybody was on the same page and go from there. Whoops. And already hit the wrong buttons. Okay, so just very briefly, as a lot of people are aware, all of the material, the information that is required to create a person and then also help keep that person healthy and alive is made up in our genes, which are found within the DNA. And the genes can be thought of as words that are spelled out using just 4 letters, A, G, T, and C. And that with that, we can really build an entire human being, and actually any organism, honestly. And that from these words, though, we actually build the various proteins that make up our body. And the important part to remember is that everything in the body, whether it's cells, your hair, everything is either made of proteins or comes from something that is made by a protein. And so these proteins and their functioning are critical for the healthy development of a person. Now, RUNX1 itself is one of those genes, and it actually has over 260,000 letters that make it up, and of which about 100,400 make up the actual protein itself. And as the cells grow and they divide, they under this many times in our lives, mistakes can happen and miscopying occurs. And so anything that comes from that cell that made a mistake, this misspelling, will have what we call a mutation. And these mistakes, if they happen in the germlines within either the sperm or the eggs, can actually be passed down to future generations, and we call that inherited. And that is a key part of the RUNX1 FPD disease, in that it can be inherited by future generations, unlike other diseases that can be caused by mistakes in genes. And RUNX1 is very important. It is what we call a transcription factor, and oftentimes people refer to it as a master regulator of the cell. And this protein is very critical for taking all the things that are happening in the cell and even outside the cell and integrating all those different signals to help the cell make decisions, whether we're going to grow, whether the cells will divide, whether or not there will be more proteins made, which proteins are being made. And so all these things come together to really affect how the cell grows and divides, and ultimately goes on to either help and support the health of a person or lead to diseases. And in RUNX1 FPD, the familiar platelet disorder, I should say, for those of you who haven't heard that term before, the RUNX1 protein is either damaged, it's reduced, or it's just completely missing altogether. And so these functions are either not there, not present, or they're changed in some way that affects the health. And so what is the most important part of this is, of course, the platelets. And here we have a picture under very high power microscopes of what platelets normally look like on the left for someone who does not have RUNX1 FPD. And on the right, we have some pictures of people who are platelets from someone who does. And you can see in the platelets, the important part of these tiny little dots, and those are granules or sacs that contain the various factors that are important for the platelet to carry out its function, which is forming the clots that help us stop bleeding. And a person who has RUNX1 FPD, as you look on the right side, you can see that these platelets, there aren't as many of them, these granules aren't as many of them. They're misshapen, they don't function well. And so as a result, the platelets themselves aren't able to carry out the clotting that's important for patients when they get a cut or a bruise or things like that. On top of it, the megakaryocytes are these giant cells that make the platelets. And in RUNX1 FPD, they don't make as many either. And so as a result of that, in RUNX1 FPD, you have 2 different problems. The platelets aren't functioning as well, and we're not producing as many. And so that leads to the various bruising and bleeding that we see with patients with the disorder. But as was mentioned by Dr. Speck, it's more than just platelets. It actually, because the entire blood system is connected, this can actually end up affecting other cell types too. And so as a result of this, we get stresses in one part of the bone marrow that can ultimately lead to inflammation, anemia, infections, and even cancer because of its effects in other parts of the bone marrow of the body. And it's important, and this has also been alluded to in the previous talks, is that not all mutations are the same. On the left, you can see different ways that you can mistakenly type a sentence. And the reality is mutations in genes are like that too. Sometimes it completely destroys the ability to understand what's being said in the gene. And sometimes it causes changes that maybe can shift the effects of the gene, but not necessarily completely destroy it. And similarly, there can be even changes that are completely silent that have no impact upon the actual way the gene works. But there is clearly been a change that has been made in the gene itself. And so as a result, we actually have a continuum of mutations from benign mutations that cause no disease to pathogenic, which are mutations that do cause diseases like RUNX1 FPD. But on top of it, there's an entire class of disease mutations, and a lot of the patients, and I know a lot of the people on this call have faced this too, called variants of unknown significance. And these are mutations that we don't really know what effect it's going to have. And it can range from benign to pathogenic and in between. And we spend a lot of our time really trying to sort out what these mutations mean and what effects that's going to have for people who have RUNX1 FPD. Now, I mentioned, of course, that RUNX1 FPD is something that's passed down through what we call the germ line. So it's inherited from one generation of people to the next within a family. But there are other mutations that can occur that are called somatic. And these are mutations that happen within the cells. And that is a normal part of aging. And over time, our cells just accumulate these little mistakes. A lot of them have very little impact to no impact upon these cells. And so the cells just ignore them and they continue on their merry way and they just slowly accumulate. But some can cause problems and can tell something about the risk or likelihood of causing cancer. And the important part is, and this is where we talk about things like BCOR and BCORL1 and TET2 and other mutations. These are a problem or can be a problem for the person who has it, but they cannot be passed down to other family members, unlike RUNX1. And it's not surprising that in the blood, where we are literally making millions of blood cells a second, we're going to accumulate these mutations with time. And everybody has these mutations, whether they have RUNX1 FPD or not. But interestingly, in RUNX1 FPD, we see certain mutations like BCOR and other mutations that are not seen as commonly in other patients. And we're trying to understand, why does RUNX1 FPD seem to prefer these mutations? What does that tell us about the risk for cancer and for other complications? And so for that, we have the natural history study. Now, a lot of you have been present, but those of you who haven't, what is the natural history study that we are running at the NIH? And it starts in several phases. It begins with a referral from a doctor or from the RRP or from just someone who finds us online, where they send us the information. We go through their records. You'll get contacted by Natalie or someone else on our team, and we'll start collecting information on you. It's important to note that while we do get a lot of referrals for RRP, because of confidentiality issues and other things like that, they can't share your information with us. And so oftentimes people will be a little confused, like, I thought I sent my records in. And the reality is, yes, you did. And we thank you for sending them to RRP and for sharing with them, but we need to get the records separately. And so that can cause some confusion. But once we've gotten all the records and everything, and that all happens at home, we then would make arrangements for your visit to the NIH. And that would cover a couple of days. It takes 2 to 3 days for the whole visit. And during that time, we'll do examinations. We'll go over your history. We'll talk about your family history. We will do the bone marrow biopsy. And oftentimes we can help provide support, whether it's pain control and things like that, to make it as pleasant of an experience as possible. And then we'll do a wrap up. And then and it takes time for all these results to come in, but then several months later, we'll go over the results that we have off of this. And sometimes we even get some of that results back within a few weeks, and we do share those results as well. It's important to note that we do want to repeat this. It isn't just a one-time event. We do repeat this at least every year or every couple of years, both for your health, to keep an eye on how things are going, but to also just see what changes with time. But it's also, we say that this is a choose your own adventure. And so we thank you for your participation in the trial, but also how involved you are is really up to you, and not just a mandatory, oh, you must come in this regularly. And so those who can be more involved, we appreciate that. We thank you. Those who can't, we thank you for what you can do when you can't participate. And it is also important, because we recognize it is a commitment to travel. that travel, lodging, and the procedures and testing are covered by the NIH. For those of you coming from places like Canada or other things, we can't pay for the travel to the United States, but once you get to the US, we do cover all travel and other things incurred while you're traveling. So how big is the study? Well, we have over 100 families that have been referred to us with well over almost 500 family members within those families. And of those 500 people, over 370 people have now been enrolled on our study. That includes a mixture of about 183 people who have confirmed RUNX1 FPD and another 187 family members who don't have RUNX1 FPD. And it's important that we include both of them because, as we know, things run through family members run through families. And so looking at both affected family members and unaffected family members helps us understand whether or not something we're seeing running through a family is really RUNX1 FPD, or if it's just the quirk of that family. And so those help us learn more about what's RUNX1 and what isn't. Of that, 120 patients have been able to visit us, including a mixture of family members and unaffected people. And over 70 people have actually had bone marrow biopsies done at the NIH. And this has provided us an unbelievably helpful wealth of information from those samples. And as you've heard, it's also allowed us to work with other people like Anupriya and others to really learn more about the disease, as well as how to treat it. But it's not just a growing community. You folks have really been a very committed community. And while we've had 74 people who have come to visit us, over 50 people have come for 2, 3, and even 4 or more visits to the NIH, and we greatly appreciate the time that you have taken for us. Now, one question that does come up, and unfortunately, I think the RRP does a good job of communicating this, but we like to communicate as well, as we work very closely, and it has been a very fruitful collaboration working with RRP. But we are separate from the RRP. And then a couple of important points is we really are focusing on sort of the basic science research and doing a longitudinal study. And so that's really what we are. We are a longitudinal study with the goal of really learning as much as we can about how this disease works and how it changes over time. Whereas the RUNX1 is really the RUNX1 program is really a collaboration and helping to build collaborations. And so to a certain extent, while we're separate, we are also a part of that. And that it really has, through RRP, a beautiful network of collaborators has been built up, of which we are happy to be one. And it's important to sort of say, though, at the end of the day, while we do have separate philosophies and different approaches to how we are tackling RUNX1 FPD, really our overall goal is to really provide education for you, for the patients, and for the medical teams. And so the questions that we get are very varied, but we seem to see a similar themes. When will you be done? What have you learned? Is the study published yet? What do I look for? When should me and my doctor be worried? How often do I have to get these bone marrows? We know no one likes them. What can I do to help my disease? And what are you doing to help my disease? And how can we change RUNX1 FPD? With regards to how long is this taking, it's important to note that this is a long-term endeavor. RUNX1 patients affect different family members. You can see here 2 different pedigrees, and we can see how even though these families all have a RUNX1 mutation, it's showing up differently through those family members. We're also trying to understand how those misspellings affect the actual way the disease presents. And one of the things we are really looking at, and other groups are looking at as well, is really understanding these VUSs and trying to understand, if I have this mutation, which has never been described before, is it benign? Is it pathogenic? And we're just beginning to understand that and take some of that information apart and really begin to be able to tell a family whether or not we think the mutation is disease causing and what exactly that shape of that disease might be. We're also learning, why is cancer more common in RUNX1 FPD? Sadly to say, of all the individuals enrolled in our study, at least 28 of them have had a blood cancer at some point, whether it was before coming out of the study or since enrolling on the study. And across the 100 families and the almost 500 people in those families, 162 individuals have been identified with blood cancer. So we do know this remains a big risk and a big concern for people with RUNX1 FPD. And we're trying to understand both what we can say in terms of who's at risk, when we might be able to identify people who might have early signs of this blood cancer, and of course, importantly, what we might be able to do to either change that course or at least intervene early enough so that it makes a difference. But not just cancer, though. There are lots of other things that we do see with RUNX1 FPD. For example, we see a lot more allergies and autoimmune disorders, and whether that is eczema, asthma, just food allergies and the like, we see a lot more of that than we would expect in the general population. And this goes along, I think, with a lot of your personal experiences. And we're beginning to understand the biology behind that. For example, we see that people who have RUNX1 FPD have higher levels of these eosinophils, which we think are cells that originally were designed to fight off parasites and the like. But now that those are no longer as big of an issue for people living in a Western lifestyle, they can now become sort of misdirected and lead to things like allergies and immune disorders. And so we begin to understand that, yes, there are more of these cells in people with RUNX1 FPD, and now can we target it? And that is where we get things like the etanercept, which may also have studies or implications for other parts of the disease as well. And of course, there are other complications beyond even the allergies. We see gastrointestinal complications and other complications. And we're still beginning to learn a lot about the things that make up RUNX1 FPD. And we'll have lots of people who are in the study come to us and be like, hey, have you ever seen this in your study, or do other people have it? And so that is really the important part that you all play beyond just simply providing us your very precious specimens, is the information and the learned experience and lived experiences of having RUNX1 FPD tells us so much about this disease, and we really appreciate that too. So what have we learned? Well, we are happy, thrilled, proud to say that we finally have published the first part of our study. And this is just the beginning, and this is not something that ends with this, but just begins with this. But those results have now been published. And so the first 100 or so patients that we have enrolled have now been summarized, and we're already starting to learn more, and people are really excited to see this. And what have we seen in that paper that was published? Well, not surprisingly, to really no one's surprise, RUNX1 is a very diverse condition. Every family has a different story, and even within those families, each family member tells the story a little differently. And so we're still beginning to tease out some of those differences and how those differences relate to the family, how they relate to the specific mutation that's found in the RUNX1 gene, or how those differences maybe relate to just the way life has unfolded for the patient who has the RUNX1 FPD. But there are very common themes: bruising and bleeding, of course. And sadly, families who have RUNX1 FPD do have more cancer. But an interesting finding we've had is that cancer and bleeding aren't always going hand in hand. Some people who have much lower platelets seem to have as high of a risk of cancer, and those who have maybe higher platelets maybe do have higher risk of cancer, but not always. And sometimes it's vice versa. So we're beginning to realize that this disease is a lot more complicated in the way the different parts of the disease play out and the way they present. But also, the one thing we really have learned from this is that your family is probably the biggest predictor of what's going to happen to you. So how your family members have experienced RUNX1 through the years is probably the biggest predictor of how it's going to present for you. But cancer remains a big concern. I think the most important takeaway is that of the families that we have enrolled, about 30 to 50% of the people in those families we are at risk for having cancer at some point in their lives. Now, fortunately, a lot of those patients have had their cancers successfully treated, and then have gone on to live healthy lives, but not always. And so this is one of the reasons that we need to remain very vigilant when we are taking care of people who have RUNX1 FPD. And that leads us to the question, well, how often do I need to get a biopsy? We do know, we have seen now from the study, that cancer risk increases with age, and that's true for anybody, but particularly true for people with RUNX1 FPD. But there's also a group of younger people, young children, who have RUNX1 FPD who get cancer that we wouldn't necessarily have expected to see. And so there seems to be these two groups of people, with sort of things being a little bit quieter around the middle part of life. But again, our family history is the biggest driver of the risk for people with RUNX1 FPD. And so we are trying to understand how these mutations and the changes that we see in the blood and the somatic changes may affect it. But ultimately, really, it's looking at your family history, and really the only way we have to best predict and to examine whether or not you are developing a cancer or at risk of developing cancer is to do those bone marrow biopsies. And so we're trying to develop things like risk scores that maybe incorporate everything, your mutation, your life history, your family history, and be able to tell which patients are closer examination versus which patients can maybe get screening less frequently. But we generally recommend that people who have RUNX1 FPD get an early baseline, preferably when they're a child, if they can be recognized that early. And then we would recommend people be monitored annually with bone marrow biopsies to get a sense of how things are changing with time. If things are stable, especially when you get into your teens and 20s, it is reasonable to start spacing bone marrow biopsies out every couple to 3 years. But we would still recommend that people get blood work done every couple of months, maybe 3 or 4 times a year. And if there are changes, to go back to more frequent bone marrow biopsies. And then in families where we really have a well-established history of cancer, we would recommend that at least and maybe even 5 to 10 years before most people develop the cancer in that family, you go back to more frequent annual bone marrow biopsies. Now, that having been said, the RRP is working with the larger consortium to really generate a consensus statement that will help take some of these hand-waving and wishy-washy statements and turn them into something that's really much more concrete and much more helpful for family members and for patients and for their medical teams to follow in terms of how that'll go. And so I think this is one of those keep watching here, because something new should be coming out, and we're very excited from that collaboration. So having said that, what should we look for? Are there any things that we need to worry about for people who have RUNX1 FPD? And I would just silently say, talk to your doctor about anything that's bothering you, or call us or talk to your hematologist. But especially things like new or worsening bruising and bleeding, obviously that could be a sign that your counts are changing. And that could just be simply part of the natural progression of RUNX1 through life, the ebb and flow, or it could be a sign of something else going on. So it's certainly something you want to keep checked out. If you have fatigue, if you have exercise intolerance, if getting upstairs is becoming more difficult, call your doctor. If you have frequent infections, now infections aren't something that typically go along with RUNX1 FPD, but if they start popping up, that could be a sign that things are changing in your bone marrow. If you're more pale, if you're starting to look a little bit more yellow, if you have abdominal fullness or things like that, unintentional weight gain or weight loss, recurrent fevers, or just anything that really seems out of the ordinary, call your doctor. It's never wrong to call your doctor, or to call us, or talk to a specialist. And then, of course, people ask, well, what can I do to help prevent cancer? Unfortunately, we don't have great treatments to prevent this, but the most important thing is just to take care of yourself, to live a healthy lifestyle, to remain connected with someone who can do the testing and help you with your monitoring. And those two things will help to ensure that regardless of what comes, you will be in the best shape possible to really tackle those problems and to give you the most likely chance of really successfully getting through whatever conditions and life has thrown at you. There are some trials coming that you'll be hearing more about, hopefully, at this session, and we are excited about them. We are associated tangentially, but those aren't ones that we are personally running, so I'll let others speak to it. And people do often ask about gene therapy, and that is an exciting field that is evolving, but unfortunately, at this point, it really isn't ready for RUNX1 FPD. So this is a slide that we show, and we keep showing every year, but there are so many questions that we are still working on, and we're going to keep working on them. We're happy to really answer these questions as they come up, and what we hear from you helps us redefine which are our priorities in terms of what we're looking at, what we're addressing, and some of the questions that were raised at the scientific session really also helped us to define new questions that we need to be looking at in the years ahead, and we'll continue to do that. And so briefly, I just wanted, these are the various people that are working. When you come to the NIH, these are the faces you'll get to see, and they will help you as you work your way through our system and help you tell your story of RUNX1 FPD. But even behind them at the NIH, but in many places, there are so many people who have been working on this the RUNX1 project who helped get this paper published and who continue to help work us. And of course, we can't not recognize the RUNX1 RRP program, the people who refer our various patients to us, and most importantly, the patients and families that really have told us the stories that helped us to really make this study possible. And so with that, I'd simply say, what other questions? What else would you like to know? I see there's things popping up the chat. Here's the contact information both for me and for Natalie, for those of you who aren't connected with the study, as well as our the website. We'd be happy to hear from anybody who has questions about their history. And we would love to bring you in to learn more about you and learn about your specific experience. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Young. That was a great presentation. I will take a couple minutes to see if people have questions. I just took a look. There's some nice commentary, some thank yous, some excitement about their visits. I see Leah clapping. We have one question in the chat that Katrina's addressed, but I'll give people a minute to raise hands if they have any questions.
It looks like Anne has a question.
Oh, thank you. I can't. Anne, do you have a question? She may have been clapping. I think she may have been clapping, but Eric has a question.
Yes.
Hi, actually Jana has a question, but we're on Eric's Zoom account. So I don't know if I saw this on the slide with the questions because it showed up really quickly and disappeared. So I don't know if my question was on there, but from the patient conference in Princeton, I had a question about, the frequency in which bone marrow biopsies were to be performed among this population, which has a history of not being the greatest at healing. And if,
Yes.
I mean, I'm 33 now. I have had 2 bone marrow biopsies as part of this study.
Mhm.
The first time was horrible. Like the recovery was like almost 3 months. And I also am a musician and do yoga, and I'm like lugging a piano around New York City, or at least I was at the time. And so I had a lifestyle that, I definitely felt pain, for much longer than was claimed for me to have been feeling pain from the recovery. But then the second time I did it, I got Amicar, and it was like night and day. It was like fine. Like a week later, it was like nothing had happened, and I didn't have as much pain, or I didn't actually have any visible bruising either of the times. But point is, the pain and the recovery was longer than I had anticipated. With Amicar, it was better, but I've just always had the question of like, some of these kids are getting introduced to this a lot younger than I was. And if you are having a bone marrow biopsy between, every year since you're, 7 to forever, I mean, how do we know if that's like safe? Or if it is, do you recommend getting a bone marrow biopsy in one place and then doing it on the side of the hip, or doing it on the other side? Or
these are all great questions. And I'm sorry that you had that experience with the first one. And we are learning, and unfortunately, because of the variability in the way people's disease presents, some people have a bone marrow biopsy and nothing really happens. Other people do have a lot of bruising, bleeding, and pain. And it's really the only way we can find out whether or not, things like Amicar, GDAVP, there's lots of different things that we can throw at people. These are fairly safe medicines, but they aren't without side effects. So we don't want to use them for everybody unless we think they're necessary. But we are learning how there are different ways you can approach this. And unfortunately, we are finding things like Amicar or Lystida really do help. And for the really severe cases, things like GDAVP can really change it, because a lot of it does have to do with that bruising, the bleeding that maybe is happening too deep to even see, but it really is still there. In terms of how often, that really is a question that we're still trying to understand. And the problem is the markers, the looking at evidence of mutations and stuff like that, it isn't really panning out quite yet, and we're still looking, but it really isn't giving us a good sense of who's at the greatest risk. And so really the only way we have of measuring what's going on in the bone marrow is that bone marrow biopsy. So it really remains the only way we can say for certain what's going on. That having been said, we are finding that probably people who get past a certain age And we do try to avoid exposure, especially to anesthesia and things like that in younger kids, because that can have impacts. But as you get to a certain age, it probably isn't necessary to do it every year, and probably can get away with doing it every 3 years, maybe. And so that reduces the amount of time you're being exposed to it, or reduce the number of times you have to undergo it. And we do know, actually, not just because we want to avoid any pain or injury, but also the bone marrow it's not distributed evenly throughout the body. And so sometimes maybe looking on the left will tell us something a little different than if we look on the right. It'll generally tell us similar things, but we might see difference. So there is benefits to shifting things around. The problem is there really are only a few places on the body that we can stick the needle and really get access to the bone marrow without having to do really very invasive procedures. And that's really only in the back. So we don't have a lot of options. I mean, I can tell you some horror stories about places where we've done it elsewhere, but those are not I don't want to scare people. So I think, unfortunately, just sort of being aware, well, I had a bad experience last year in this spot. Maybe this time, can we try this side? I think that's a very reasonable thing to do. And then once you kind of have that baseline, you say, oh, you really have been rock steady for the last 3-4 years. Maybe we just do blood work and keep an eye on things and make sure nothing's changing. And then we'll redo your marrow in a couple of years, and then maybe stretch it out a little bit more. And trying to avoid doing more than we think we need to, but not so infrequently that we worry that we're going to miss something and miss that window where we might have been able to treat you quickly and get more likely to get a good outcome than if we waited longer and the disease is more progressed. It's a balancing act, and we really don't know the exact the best way to handle that. And that really is, I think, probably one of the most common themes that we get outside of the questions of just the disease itself, is how do we balance those?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Dr. Young. Katrine, did you want to?
Yeah, maybe if I can just comment, Jana, we hear you, and we've heard this from many different patients. And one of the things we've been thinking about, and I've been speaking with other organizations like the Schwachman-Diamond Syndrome Alliance. This is an organization that also has a high predisposition to blood cancers, and their family, those patients feel the same way about these frequent bone marrows. And so one of the things we're thinking about is, could we start a study where we test the sensitivity of doing a blood draw versus a bone marrow to see, can we get the same information as with a bone marrow? Because technology is advancing and our ability to sequence or pick up mutations is getting better and better. So maybe we're at the time now to start testing whether we can get the same information from a peripheral blood draw and avoid the bone marrow. That study hasn't been done and we don't have that information, but it's something we're really thinking about and seeing if we can collaborate with others. Because it's such a big issue for patients, and we want to find out if that kind of technology is available to date that would provide enough information. So something we're thinking about, and it would be very expensive, and so we have to think about how do we fund something like that as well. But thank you for your question.
And that's something we've also been looking at too.
If I could just say really quick, like, just in case, I'm not trying to scare anybody. I'm not trying to be discouraging. I actually had really great experiences at the NIH both times. And the analogy I was given was like, if you have a car factory and the car factory, a certain model of car, Honda HRV, it's just what we have, is circulating in the factory, which is the bone marrow, and then still circulating in the road, right? In the world, on the road, on the street, like in your blood. But the factory has stopped making the cars. So if you're getting your blood drawn, the cars are still going to be on the road, but you're not going to know if the factory is like still making it. And so I personally, like, I see the value of a bone marrow biopsy. I'm not trying to get out of it. I'm probably going to do it, not every single year, but every 2 to 3 years as my baseline. That's just like what my comfort level is. But I I'm not trying to get out of the bone marrow biopsy at all. It was just more of a question of like, I mean, if kids are doing this since they're 8, by the time they're 30, are they going to have back problems? Or, are they going to have like issues with bone development? Or I don't know anything. I'm making stuff up. I just am thinking like if I were to have started that young, if we even know what the potential side effects of doing something that regularly for that long could be. And like, I think when I went to the NIH, they were like, well, you did this hip last time. Do you want to do the other hip, or do you want to do the other side? And I was like, okay, if you think I should, is it going to get weaker there? I had no idea. So it was just stuff I was.
Actually, the bone does heal well, but and I think Katrina actually mentioned an important point is, although RUNX1 is relatively speaking a younger disorder, or has been only recognized for less time, there are other conditions like Fanconi anemia, Schwachman-Diamond, where we do have, I think, better experience and much more long-term experience with that. And so far, at least from the standpoint of the risk benefit, and it's not to say that there aren't side effects and there aren't consequences of these bone marrows. It does seem that the ability to detect the cancer in a lot of those conditions has way outweighed the complications. But that having been said, it is very important to keep that in mind when we're taking care of people with RUNX1 FPD and other similar disorders, that these are side effects that can happen. And while on the whole, it might be better to do it than not to, this can have very significant impacts on people who have the condition, and to make sure we're taking that into account when we're tailoring their treatment and their monitoring, things like that. It is a very important point. Thank you.
So, thank you all. This is such an important conversation. Dr. Cunningham, I know you're one of our next speakers. And I'm thinking of you and the others when I look at the time, and I know we're like almost 15 minutes over. Do you have a comment on the development piece? Because I know that was one thing that was missing. I know you're a pediatrics. And I wonder if we can just move on from there.
Yeah, we're running behind. I'll do my best just to say 2 things very quickly. Wonderful talk by Dr. Young and all the people who spoke so far today. Wonderful platform and foundation for the rest of the day. In terms of the peripheral blood versus bone marrow, a lot of the data comparing both bone marrow and peripheral blood have been in circulating leukemia, where there's a lot of blasts in the peripheral blood. So the cases there's actually some published literature suggesting that for MDS and the low circulating peripheral blast, you can't compare the two because they're different. And I can send out those resources around in terms of those publications. Because P53 and RUNX1 were the 2 mutations that they could not find in the peripheral blood, but they were in the marrow. So anyway, my second point is to Ms. Jana and her analogies. And basically, I'm also trying to follow along in the chat that, basically, people need to do what works. And so the last time I looked at the data, and David and others would have more up to date, but approximately 21% of people had required Amicar or other anti-bleeding, other medications for their marrows. If there's any discomfort whatsoever, call early, call often. If you're taking Amicar for 2 or 3 days, take it for 5 days, take it for 7 days. Like Dr. Young said, there are risks, for excessive clotting, which you also don't want. There is a subpopulation of people who respond great to DDAVP and others who don't respond at all. We had, one person who responded to Humate-P, which is a von Willebrand drug, which I could not understand, still don't understand the mechanism, worked great for him. So all that to say, don't give up. And also, if you have a strong family history, there are people who have malignancy in every single generation in their family. If it were me and my marrow, I would go ahead and get it. If I needed, fentanyl or Versed or whatever to get through that marrow, I would do it. To miss it is just would be a little bit too much to bear for me. So basically, what I'm trying to say by that is we have had people walk in the building for their surveillance marrow, and we found MDS, which is not what anyone wants, both on this study as well as on related studies. So we're over. I'm going to stop talking. Thank you.